The Ash effect, Zimbardo's prison experiment really gives us cause to look at how the aspect of functioning groups can really impact behavior and what that can mean. Okay, so let's go ahead and work here and try and see if we can't figure out or finish up our slides on social, the impact of social behavior and that kind of thing. One of the aspects that's really fascinating about social psychology is how that can impact performance. Now, very early on, hey, how are you? I'm okay, of course. Very early at my throat, my voice is hoarse. I'm not recovering. I don't have my basketball voice yet. Very early on in class, we talked about performance and how psychology can impact performance. Does anybody remember the example we used? This would be like the first or second lecture, yeah.
It was like players play really bad in like championships.
Sure, so it was the levels of stress, the impact of stress on performance. We talked about an inverted U or Yerkes-Dodson law there, where stress is low or high, performance is bad. When stress is in an optimal position, performance is the best that we can get there. In addition to how stress can impact performance, there are other things that can also impact performance. And our interactions with those around us and our interactions with our peers can also dramatically impact performance, all right? And this can happen in a couple of different ways. Sometimes social groups can actually facilitate performance. Social groups can actually facilitate performance if you're being observed. If you're being observed, it can actually facilitate performance and how you do. However, it's not a universal thing that being observed or being in a social group will actually facilitate performance. It depends on the task difficulty, how hard the particular task is. If the task is really, really easy, it's not going to impact something all that much. If the task is incredibly challenging, it's not going to impact things all that much. It's if the task difficulty at some level matches with your particular ability set. Social facilitation can, or social groups can actually facilitate performance, okay? Other things which are critical. It depends on your ability. It's not just how difficult the task is, it's how good you are at the task. If it's something that you deem yourself good at, social groups will actually often facilitate your performance. If it's something you're good at, or you think you're good at it, doing it inside of a social group will facilitate your performance. If it's something you're not that good at, being observed, being in a social group will actually impair your performance. It doesn't necessarily mean you are good at it, it just means you think you're good at it. So part of it is your belief in yourself, okay? So, an example of this, I can no longer run really very well. My right knee is bone on bone, so running is pretty much out of the question, at least long distance running. So I took up biking, and I very much like biking. And when the weather's nice, I bike to campus, and I go home up the hill, the upper, which is just the nastiest thing in the world. I mean, that hill, biking up that thing is just a disaster, okay? But one of the things that I observe is I think I'm a pretty good biker. I actually think I'm a fairly decent climber on a bike. And if there are other people around on the hill, my climb will be better. Because it's a difficult task, but it's inside of my ability, and I think I'm good at it. So I will tend to do better if other people are there than if I'm climbing the hill by myself. I'm not, even though I coach basketball, I'm not a good basketball player. So if I have to play basketball while other people are watching, I'm probably going to do worse. My ability is not very good in terms of the skill set that's required for basketball. So it all depends on that. Social groups can facilitate behavior, but only under particular situations. Social groups can also go the other way. How many of you like group projects? Oh, I wish the faculty member would assign group projects. Nobody likes group projects? You do? You do, really? Why do you like them? Okay, yeah, you can work with other people and spread out the work and all that kind of stuff. So one of us likes social, or one of us likes group projects, the rest of us don't. Why don't the rest of you like group projects? People don't carry their weight. It always falls on you to do it, right? And that's one of the problems with social groups, is it facilitates social loafing. It facilitates the ability to say, I'm not going to do it, you do it. I'm not going to do it, somebody else does it. How does this happen? Well, accountability inside of a group gets dispersed. Accountability in a group gets dispersed. It's not my fault, it's the group's fault. And while I'm a member of the group is not me. So accountability gets spread apart, or it gets dispersed out among everybody. So it's less focused on me. I can be dispensable. I don't have to do it. It still will get done. As long as a group has one person in it that will work hard, it'll get done. So it doesn't really matter. I'm more dispensable. I can get a free ride out of it. People will, if effort is required, people sometimes will give the minimum and try and get the maximum out of it. Performance, I don't know what that word's supposed to be. Performance can also be drastically altered if you de-individualize the person. If you de-individualize them. Now that shouldn't be surprising considering what we've just talked about on social loafing. The more you're in a group, the less of an individual you are. The less of an individual you are, social groups will have less effect on you. Okay? So if you're only identified by a number instead of your name, there's less pressure there than to be able to perform. This is one of the things we want to keep in mind, not only for ourselves, but also if we're working in groups, or someday if you're an employer or a supervisor and you're trying to motivate your group to work, different ways that you can actually perform that. Groups are also really fascinating. You see this happen. We talk about this occasionally in class. This happens tremendously. Group polarization. So I mentioned this the other day in class when I talked about an echo chamber. And we'll talk a little bit about that in here. How do groups end up getting so polarized? Now, when we say polarized, what we mean is opposite of one another. Okay? Diametrically opposed to one another, different from one another. When a group is together and a group functions, the belief system, the prevailing inclinations inside of a group tend to get more polarizing over time. Inside of a group, they tend to get more polarizing over time. It can happen both in positive and negative ways. The polarization can be in positive ways. We're going to motivate ourselves to do this even better, to do this even more. It can be negative. You can polarize in a bias against another particular group. What is interesting is virtually, which is in some ways the world we now live in, that's not seen as much. The polarization occurs more intensely if the group is physically meeting than if the group is virtually meeting. There's something about being inside of the group that causes that to happen. There's tremendous weaknesses associated with this. It produces groupthink. It produces groupthink. Now, what is groupthink? The group itself tends to start agreeing with itself And that just continues along. So as you agree with yourself more and more, you begin to polarize your beliefs because now you agree in that polarized belief a little bit more, and you continue that way. There's nobody there to say, but what about this other thought? If everybody's in agreement, the belief system tends to continue to polarize. You know this whole Minnesota nice thing that people talk about? I don't do that well. It's not that I don't, I think I'm a nice person. I just think I'm a direct person. I don't know if those are counterposed to each other or not. But if you're in the minority in a group, and are willing to engage, you can have a tremendous influence. A tremendous influence in terms of how well you're heard and how it can modify positions. Because one individual can stop groupthink. So if you have a group of people that are all believing the same thing and they start polarizing, if you just have one individual inside of that group who's willing to say, yeah, but what about this? That stops the ability for groupthink to occur. You know, you're going to get my own opinion here right now, okay? So take it a second. I think a lot of the COVID restrictions that we have, let's take the university. At the university is a degree of this. Whatever you believe about masks, okay, and I'm not saying anything about whether we should or should not be wearing it, right? I find it, when I've interacted with administrators that are making the decision on COVID restrictions on campus, you know, I'll ask them why are you doing this? Why are you mandating masks? Just tell me why. You know, I'm going to wear one because my employer tells me to. But why are we? There's not a lot of an answer that comes from that. So I'll ask, okay, why are we wearing it in classrooms? But when we went to the football game, I mean, the students were all packed into those bleachers, right? Where you're sitting like right next to the person and yelling and screaming and all of that kind of stuff. Why is that not masked? You know, the lack of that. I think we can get into this thing where we just begin to not ask the question, well, why should we or why shouldn't we do this? And that kind of stuff. I think groupthink is awful. So I said I don't do Minnesota nice well. When I was chair of the psychology department, one of the things I believe, for me, this is just me, as a characteristic of a leader is I want people in the room that have strong voices and are willing to advocate for their position. We don't have to agree with each other. Now, we have to be respectful with each other, but we don't have to agree with each other. And I want people that will give me contrary position, because it's easy to convince yourself you're right. It's incredibly easy to convince yourself that you are right. And it takes this minority influence to think about stuff and whatnot. So, anybody have a thought, comment on that you want to offer? It's the end of the semester, I get it. Okay, anti-social relations. This is prejudice. David Sparkman in the Department of Psychology studies prejudice. He's fantastic. Go talk with him if you want to. Prejudice and discrimination. It can be both overt and subtle. Prejudice can be both overt prejudice and subtle prejudice. And you have to keep that in mind, okay? I'll give you a couple of examples of each one and how we can have positive and negative things associated with it. For overt prejudice or overt discrimination, we all know prime examples of that, where someone says something that is just completely beyond the pale, or acts in a way that's completely beyond the pale against somebody else, without any reason to, other than a belief system or an underlying prejudice associated with it. Subtle prejudice can be somewhat different, or somewhat harder to detect. So one aspect of subtle prejudice would be wage gaps that exist, where females tend to be paid less than males do for doing exactly the same job. Now, why is that subtle? That might seem more direct. Well, often nobody knows what anybody's making, so it's easier to be able to hide that, okay? And be able to hold that. One of the things that's challenging with subtle discrimination is we have to always ask the question, how does that impact what we know about psychology? So one thing that is a hot topic right now is ideas of microaggressions. Do microaggressions exist? Do microaggressions not exist? And it's just a base definition of microaggression would be a slight which is unintentional to somebody else. Okay? So we behave or say something in a way which unintentionally offends somebody else. And one of those that happened here at the university that I was actually that I was engaged in at some level was when we moved to Asia. One of the things that was really fascinating was I could not identify anybody. Everybody looked exactly the same to me. It was very, very hard for me. As you've learned in being in my class, it's hard for me to identify each one of you as individuals by name and that kind of. I'm awful at that. But here I noticed I was really bad about it. But after about 3 years of living in Singapore, not only was I able to identify individuals, but by looking at somebody, I could usually identify country of origin. Because most countries of origin have something different visual appearances associated with it, whether it just be hairstyle or bone structure or something like that. And that, excuse me, highlights the fact that individuals of one race are very bad at identifying individuals of a different race. And if you've not been around people of another race, of a particular race, you're even worse at it. You can learn to get better. And that's been demonstrated multiple times in psychology. It's called the outrace effect, or the other race effect. We're just not as good at identifying individuals of a different race until we have a lot of experience with interacting with people of that race. And that is one aspect of microaggressions, that one race doesn't do a very good job of identifying individuals of another race. And that raises the question, is that really a slight, or is that just psychology that we can learn our way through? So I think those are things which are important questions as we begin to think about these topics and how we treat each other fairly and equitably, is don't forget the data that psychology's done a great job of demonstrating inside of it. How do prejudice develop? For a variety of things. This is not in any way an exhaustive list. This is not in any way an exhaustive list of how prejudice develops. Sometimes prejudice can develop because we deal in a just world phenomenon. We believe the world's just. It's not, but we believe the world is just. And because the world's just, we believe that particular individuals are getting what they deserve. I don't know what this person's done wrong, but they had to have done something wrong because I'm rich and they're not. Or whatever. Insert your own thing there however you want to. And because of that, we're being biased now against that individual or that class or that group simply because we're assuming that because they're not as high as we are on some measure, they must have done something wrong. They must have done something wrong. The in-group, out-group, in-group bias effect. This is incredibly salient. We all belong to groups. And if you're in our group, if you're in the group that you belong to, that's your in-group. People who are not in that group but are in another group on the same topic are in the out-group. We tend to have a bias toward the people that are in our group at the expense of people who are in the out group. You all are the best intro to psychology students this semester, significantly better than the other sections. All right? Because we're all this group. We're an in group. The other sections are the out group. We're better than they are. We have a bias toward believing the groups that we are in are better. We have a prejudice against the individuals that do not select into our group. Now think of how that can interact with this idea of an echo chamber. This idea of group polarization. As our groups polarize more and more and more, we begin to reach the opinion that the other group is significantly worse and worse and worse. Back when I was your age, politics was a completely different thing than it is now. I feel sorry for y'all. I can't tell you how sorry I feel for y'all. Back in the day, if you watched political debate, where candidates were actually debating, occasionally there would be free-for-alls and amazing one-liners that everybody would remember. But they actually debated issues. And they would talk about economic plans and the impact on this factor and that factor. And there would be data, and they'd talk about the data. It was like a legitimate debate. If you watch the presidential debate or a vice presidential debate or a Senate or House debate in the last 10 years, they've been grotesquely insulting in terms of it. And part of that is we've lost the ability to think, I disagree with you, we're part of different groups, but that doesn't make you an awful person. That doesn't make you an atrocious individual. That doesn't make you less than. It's just you have a different opinion on how government works than I do. So when this goes further and further and further, we end up in a position where no longer do we have prejudice against an individual. We actually discriminate against individuals that belong to particular groups. And that's something that I think psychology has a lot to say as that impacts the world that we live in. Scapegoat theory. We always have to have somebody to blame things on, right? If you want to survive in the world as a manager, always have deniable plausibility and somebody else to blame. If you can do that, you'll be successful, unfortunately. Always leave somehow where you can deny it, and two, somebody else to blame, okay? The scapegoat theory is you always want somebody else to blame. When Hitler rose to power, one of the ways he was able to do that, because Germany's economy was crushed at that point following World War I, he blamed an ethnic religious group for the problem. A scapegoat existed, and that allowed the public of Germany to rally around that idea and form an in-group, which then allowed Hitler to rise to power. The ability to blame somebody else, even if that individual isn't even involved or to blame for it. And then finally, vivid cases. Melissa's family, where I was at last week, lives in Poplar Bluff, Missouri. Poplar Bluff, Missouri is 20 miles from the Arkansas line. It is the world of rice and cotton fields. And it is the most bizarre place I have ever been in my entire life. Because of the belief systems that exist there. And a lot of prejudice, discrimination exists in vivid cases. If I was to ask somebody, why do you down there? If I was to ask somebody in Poplar Bluff, why do you believe that? Usually what they would say is, I knew this person decades ago who did this. So they have a vivid case, and off of that they build an entire belief system around it. what's interesting about that is, one, you usually don't understand the situation. You've observed part of something and filled in all the details which you don't understand to make it even worse than it is. And you've generalized that one individual to an entire group. So it often develops off of vivid cases. And this is something that's a challenge, that we continue as a society need to work on in terms of that. Comments, questions? What happens when prejudice goes really bad? We get aggression. Phineas Gage in psychology is our most vivid example of aggression. Phineas was a Canadian, and he was building railroad tracks. And when you build railroad tracks, you want the railroads to be fairly flat, the tracks to be flat. Up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. Might be good for roller coasters, not good for railroads. So what you do when you come to a rock is you blow it up. I always thought that would be kind of fun. I'd always like to blow something up. I've never had an opportunity to do that. But I don't want to have Phineas Gage's experience, because he was loading a charge to blow up some rocks, and the charge blew up. Wouldn't that be bad? And it shot a metal rod through his head, came up through his cheek and out the top of his head, right through his brain. Somehow the dude lived. I have no idea. Isn't that crazy? Before the accident, Phineas was actually a really nice guy. After the accident, Phineas was an awful mean person. Not that he didn't do Minnesota nice. He did as far away from that as you can get. Mean and surly. And the question is, what happened there? Phineas actually ended up having a lesion of a brain area called the septum. Remember me telling you about the rat that chased me around the animal facility? That rat had septal rage. Same thing Phineas had. Anytime that brain area gets destroyed, it produces rage in an individual. Okay? Another brain area is called the amygdala. We talked about that very early. It's part of the limbic system. Can anybody tell me what the amygdala does? Remember, yeah.
Isn't it emotionally latent memories?
Yeah, emotionally latent memories. It plays a role in emotion. Emotionally latent memories. If you stimulate the amygdala, it will produce aggression. I had a friend in Singapore who studied this. I have no idea. I thought it was the most fascinating thing. But I'm not sure really what you would do with it. I don't know how it's changing the world. But he was studying this bacteria. And the bacteria would, let me make sure I get this right, would impact the amygdala of mice. It was a bacteria or a virus, one of the two, that only impacted mice. Okay? And what it would do is it would cause the amygdala to become activated. So when the amygdala of these mice became activated because that virus was there, the mouse became aggressive. Okay? So you got aggressive mice running around the world. To demonstrate this, he would put the mouse in a container with a cat. That's a bad situation for the mouse, right? It's even worse if you're an aggressive mouse. Because the aggressive mouse would come running over to the cat to attack it, and the cat would eat it. Something okay. But the virus could only replicate in the gut of a cat. I don't know why, but it's the only place it can replicate. So the mouse would attack the cat would eat the mouse, the virus would then replicate in the cat's gut, the cat would excrete it in its feces, and infect another mouse. It's like zombie mice, right? Except in the movies, the zombies always win almost. Here, it's just a virus causing the mouse to get eaten. Bad virus, right? So the amygdala is critical. If you stimulate the amygdala, you get aggression, even in the face of situations where aggression should not be shown. Mice in the presence of a predator should not attack. We can't be interested in the idea of how does our hormones impact aggression. And a lot of this work was done initially by sampling testosterone levels or serotonergic levels in people who are incarcerated. People who are incarcerated. What was found was people who were incarcerated have higher testosterone levels, and particularly, I'll get to that in a minute. People who are incarcerated have higher testosterone levels, and they have lower serotonin levels. They have lower serotonin levels, okay? There's a strain of rats that have lower serotonin levels, and they bite like, they're vicious. They really want to bite your hand, okay? So, the problem with that research is, if you're in an incarceration state, that's a very different world. So, did the high levels of testosterone and low levels of serotonin cause people to commit crimes which led to incarceration? Or, once they were incarcerated and we measured those values, did the incarceration situation raise testosterone levels and lower serotonin levels? That's part of the problem with this research. We don't know which one's first. It's correlational. Correlations don't tell us about cause and effect. Okay? However, there are other interesting correlations associated with this. Everybody take your dominant hand, the one you write with. Okay? Hold it up. Put your fingers together like this. Okay? And look at your index finger, skip over the lacrosse finger, and go to your ring finger. Okay? The difference in length between the index finger and the ring finger is testosterone driven. Well, it's heavily testosterone correlated. Okay? If you're sitting next to a female, look at hers. Hers will be much closer in length. If you're looking at a guy, it'll be much different in length. More likely, on average. Okay? Now, those are averages. Within one of the sexes, some males will have fairly similar, some males will have quite dramatically different ones. Some females will have very similar, some females will have different, okay? So that is something that's sex dependent. However, if you measure the difference in height between the index finger and the ring finger, it correlates strongly to aggression measures. The bigger the difference, the more aggressive you're usually deemed as being. If you want to be socially appropriate, you're direct. You're not aggressive. If you do it with gamblers, the more aggressive gambles they'll make, more aggressive bets they'll make. If you do it with stockbrokers, the ones with bigger differences are more aggressive in the stocks they pick. So when you're managing your portfolio, the first thing you need to ask your stockbroker is, let me see your hand. Right? And make sure that matches up to the risk factor that you want to have. Alright? So there are correlations and very quick ones and easy ones to do that give us a measure of what some of these particular things are. Alright, that's all bad stuff. We don't like aggressive people. We don't like mean people. Yuck on them. Say it with me. Yuck. Yuck. Yeah. Boo on them. That should be, we could make a license of, what are those things called? Huh? Ringtone? No, that would be a good ringtone.
Bumper sticker?
If it rang and it said meet people stuff. Yeah, bumper sticker that said that. Somebody else probably did it though. Let's do the other side of it, pro-social behavior. These are nice people. These are Minnesota nice people after a Vikings victory. So they're hard to find. Okay. Come on, you all lost to the Lions, right? You gotta, you did win last night though, I will give you that. Okay. How we cook that game. Alright, what causes people to be nice? What causes people to be nice? The closer in proximity you are, the more nice you're going to be. That makes sense. If you're around somebody, the closer in proximity, the nicer you're going to be. You're going to be more nice face-to-face than you are virtual. Right? How many of you are like, whoever that person is online is a real jerk? But then when you meet him face-to-face, you're like, oh, that's you? You know, because it's like, no, that's not right. So, face-to-face usually tends to make people nicer than this virtual thing. Physical attractiveness. People that, for whatever reason in a society are deemed as physically attractive, are usually perceived as being healthier, happier, more sensitive, more successful, and more socially skilled. Just based off of how someone looks, we tend to assume all of these other pro-social behaviors about them. Now that raises an interesting question. Many people call me direct. Are they calling me ugly too? I think that's what they're saying. I just realized that at this moment. That hurts. All right, it's also very culturally dependent. Why is that? Because attraction is different in different cultures. And it's important, the effect is not different, but what can drive it among people is different. Okay, one of the most extreme cases of pro-social behavior could be thought of as love. Now, I'm not talking about lust here. I'm talking about love, okay? And that's a challenging thing. Melissa and I have been married for 29 years. We're coming up on our 30th year in May. I don't know how she stayed with me. I'll just be candid with you, okay? And part of that is just that belief system that you just stay together. I came from a blended family, and I know that nightmares of sadness. Okay, so there are different types of love, right? We have passionate, we can have compassionate love. We tend to self-disclose ourselves to those that we love, that we have this love. We tend to let them see the good and the bad. Melissa has seen me at my best, and she's seen me at my absolute worst. And we talk about that, and we engage inside of that. When I talk about the two theory states of emotion, don't worry about it. One of the things that's critical inside of this, is love does change. If you look at marriages, the divorce rate is pretty high. And it usually happens somewhere between 4 to 6 years after a marriage. Very challenging time right there. And that's because this basic love that you have when you get married, okay, wanes away after 4 to 6 years of marriage. And if it's not replaced with the fact that you're sharing your life together and a different kind of love develops, that's when you often run into problems that relates to that. I've also, because I spent so much time as a missionary in India, I've attended multiple weddings where the bride and the groom met each other at that moment. When they stood on the stage, that's the very first time they met each other. So an arranged marriage. What's amazing about that is in arranged marriages, the divorce rate is significantly less than non-arranged marriage. Why is that? Well, because the love that you have when you get married doesn't stay. But when you're doing that development of a life together, that's the love that gets you through multiple decades of stuff. Those are always really interesting weddings because you can watch the bride and the groom and you can see they're trying to look at each other like, okay, who are you? All right, and then finally, altruism. Altruism is one of the hardest things for most of science to explain. An altruistic behavior is unselfish regard for others. Unselfish regard for others. You place yourself in jeopardy or harm so that somebody else does good. And we're at 9:50, 8:50 right now. Let's just hold there and I'll finish altruistic behavior on Monday. We'll do a little bit of clinical psychology on Monday.